Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In this video, I'm going to talk about the events that led up to the 1974 double dissolution election, as they're part of the tapestry of interwoven events that contributed to the 1975 dismissal. The elections for the House of Representatives and for half the Senate had come out of kilter in the 1960s. Although the Whitlam government was first elected on the 2nd of December 1972, the next half-Senate election was due in early 1974. One way of manipulating Senate elections back then was to ensure that a casual vacancy occurred for a senator less than halfway through their 6-year term, so that their seat also went up for election at the next half-Senate election. That meant that instead of electing 5 senators for each relevant state, there would be 6 senators. In 1974, the Whitlam government came up with the cunning plan of simultaneously getting rid of Queensland Senator Vince Gair and winning the extra seat at the forthcoming half-Senate election. Gair had an interesting history. He'd been a Labor Premier of Queensland, but his government was brought down in 1957 by its own supply crisis. The Labor Party had split, and Gair and his supporters were expelled from it. The remaining members of the Labor Party joined the opposition in blocking supply to the Gair government, resulting in an election at which the opposition was swept into power. Gair then joined the Democratic Labor Party, the DLP, and was later elected to the Senate in 1964. By 1975, he'd lost the leadership of his party and he was disgruntled with political life. He was therefore open to the idea of a new job. The then Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, in his account to the Queen of the Gair affair, said that the Queen, quote, may possibly remember the sight of him as a short, fat, red-faced, garrulous, coarse and half-drunk guest last October, unquote. He continued, once respected as a tough and shrewd politician who could see the way a cat would jump even when it was still sleeping, he was correctly evaluated by Mr. Whitlam as a man who had now become venal through self-indulgence, unquote. The Queen's private secretary replied more tactfully that the Queen did indeed remember Mr. Gair, but with happier memories when he travelled with her on the ship Gothic off the Barrier Reef in 1954 when he was Queensland Premier. Despite the fact that Gair had been expelled from the Labor Party and was about the least diplomatic person one could possibly imagine, he was offered the post of Ambassador to Ireland in order to cause a casual vacancy in his seat. Labor took the view that while it would win 2 out of 5 Senate seats in the forthcoming half-Senate election, it would win 3 out of 6, boosting its numbers in the Senate if there was a casual vacancy to fill. As explained in my more detailed video on the Night of the Long Prawns, Gair's resignation from the Senate was delayed by coalition members tempting him with beer and prawns and ensuring that he attended the Senate to vote on the PMA Bill. More about that bill later. They did this to show that he was still exercising his powers as a senator and had not resigned. In the meantime, that evening, the wily Queensland Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen ensured that the Queensland Governor issued the writs for 5 places rather than 6 in the half-Senate election before Gair had resigned. Outfoxed, Whitlam and Murphy then argued that Gair was already disqualified as a senator for accepting an office of profit under the Crown in breach of Section 44 of the Constitution. Yet, this was the complete opposite of what they had twice assured the Governor-General in the preceding days. Hasluck, as a former politician who knew about these things, expressly asked whether the steps he was about to take in the Executive Council in nominating Gair as ambassador would trigger the disqualification provision. Whitlam and his Attorney-General, Lionel Murphy, assured the Governor-General that these steps would not trigger the constitutional disqualification because it was only a nomination and not an appointment. The complete about-turn on this issue, along with other instances of dubious legal advice to the Governor-General, led to a build-up of distrust between the Governor-General's office and the government. The impression was given that the government was prepared to deceive the Governor-General and give whatever legal advice was politically convenient in the circumstances. Desperate to secure his political advantage in Queensland, Murphy then moved a motion in the Senate to have Gair's status referred to the Court of Disputed Returns. The Senate, however, amended the motion to declare that Gair was still a senator when the writs were issued for the half-Senate election. It censured the government and called upon it to resign. The step of last resort was the commencement of legal proceedings in the High Court to declare the half-Senate writ to be invalid. However, the outrage that was provoked in the Senate by the Gair affair was such that the Senate moved to defer passing the supply bills until such time as the government agreed to face the people in an election. The Whitlam government responded by seeking a double dissolution election, forcing the entire Senate to face election, given that it had lost out on its attempt to manipulate the numbers in Queensland. Hasluck noted in his report to the Queen that it was clear that Whitlam had not intended to hold a double dissolution, but rather a half-Senate election. Hasluck said that Whitlam, quote, attempted in mid-March to play a smart trick by the appointment of a Queensland senator as ambassador to Ireland, and that was proof that he had in mind only an election for half the Senate and not a double dissolution, as the trick would be purposeless if a double dissolution were in prospect, unquote. He went on to explain how the trick started the chain of events that led to the double dissolution. This is where we get to two interesting factors about the double dissolution. The first is that when Whitlam came to see Hasluck to request a double dissolution, Hasluck had to remind Whitlam that a dissolution could not be granted unless Whitlam first secured supply to cover the election period. Every Prime Minister, when requesting a dissolution, always formally advises the Governor-General that there is supply to cover the election period, because otherwise there's a risk that the dissolution may be refused and the government may be replaced. This incident shows that Whitlam had already been forcefully reminded by a different Governor-General of the importance of supply and that a Governor-General would not accept a request for an election unless supply was assured. Hasluck even wrote to the Queen reporting that he received an assurance that supply had been granted before he dissolved Parliament. Whitlam had indeed gone back to Parliament and said that a dissolution was forthcoming, and the opposition had agreed to pass supply in those circumstances. The second issue concerned whether the conditions of a double dissolution under Section 57 of the Commonwealth Constitution had been met. Section 57 was inserted in the Commonwealth Constitution to deal with deadlocks between the two houses. There are strict conditions that a bill must meet before it can trigger a double dissolution. It must have been passed first by the House of Representatives. Then the Senate must have rejected it or failed to pass it, or passed it with amendments to which the House of Representatives will not agree. Then, after 3 months, the process has to be repeated. The flaw in this is the reference to fails to pass. How do you know when the Senate has failed to pass a bill, or whether it's just taking reasonable time to consider the bill? The same conditions also apply to referendum bills that are passed by one house only under Section 128 of the Constitution. Back in 1973, the House of Representatives passed a referendum bill on simultaneous elections. It was sent to the Senate on the 4th of December 1973, but the Senate referred it to a parliamentary committee. The government wanted to interpret that referral to a committee as a failure to pass the bill, so that the 3-month period could start immediately and the bill could then be put to a referendum at the next half-Senate election. But the new Solicitor General, Maurice Byers, very inconveniently advised that it had not failed to pass because it was reasonable for the Senate to have time to scrutinise the bill. The Whitlam government just ignored the Solicitor General's advice. The Prime Minister and the Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, advised the Governor-General that all of the referendum bills met the requirements of Section 128 of the Constitution, and Murphy also provided a written legal opinion to that effect. They made no reference at all to the Solicitor General's different view. All the referendums failed, but had that one passed, it was likely there would have been a successful challenge to it. How do we know that? Well, a similar failure to pass issue arose in relation to one of the bills used to trigger the 1974 double dissolution. That was the Petroleum and Minerals Authority Bill, known as the PMA Bill. This gave rise to the same issue about whether it had failed to pass. This was the bill that the inebriated prawn-filled Vince Gair had voted on while the Queensland Governor was issuing the writs for 5 seats in the half-Senate election. It had originally passed the House of Representatives on the 12th of December 1973 and been sent to the Senate. The following day, debate started on the bill, but it was adjourned because the Senate rose that day for the Christmas break until its return in February. The Whitlam government counted the 3 months as running from the 13th of December, even though the bill had not been rejected and had barely been discussed. When the Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, was advised on the 10th of April 1974 to grant the double dissolution, he received 2 separate legal opinions. One was a joint opinion by Byers and Murphy that a double dissolution could be granted with respect to more than one bill, a proposition which the High Court later agreed with in the case of Cormack and Cope in 1974. The other was an opinion by Murphy alone that each of the bills, including the PMA Bill, satisfied the requirements of Section 57. Presumably, either Byers refused to give such an opinion or was not asked because it was known that he wouldn't agree. Hasluck, however, didn't smell a rat. In granting the double dissolution, Hasluck wrote that he had, quote, accepted the learned opinion of the Attorney General, unquote, not knowing that the learned Solicitor General correctly took a different view. Hasluck also recorded that Whitlam went through each bill with him and stated that he thought the record was clear that they would satisfy the terms of Section 57. Hasluck stated that he was primarily interested in the failure to pass and that the record should be, quote, such as to do us credit in the eyes of the constitutional critic and historian, unquote. Well, it didn't, did it? What's the relevance of all this? Well, it takes us to Sir John Kerr's dissatisfaction with the legal advice that he received from the Crown Law officers. The Section 57 process did not only permit a double dissolution, it also provided that if, after the election, the House of Representatives passed the same bills and they were again rejected by the Senate or failed to pass, the Governor-General could convene a joint sitting of the 2 houses to vote on the bills. After Kerr became Governor-General, one of the first legal issues he faced was the issuing of a proclamation for a joint sitting of both houses to deal with those double dissolution bills. When Kerr looked at the details of the bills, he realised that it was, quote, extremely doubtful indeed, unquote, that the PMA Bill satisfied the conditions of Section 57. He raised the question of whether he could include this bill in the proclamation for the joint sitting because it didn't seem to qualify. Kerr was then given a joint opinion by Murphy and Byers that he was bound by Sir Paul Hasluck's decision to list the bill as one of the double dissolution bills and that he couldn't act contrary to that in issuing the proclamation. The opinion asserted that the Constitution did not permit the Governor-General by one act of state to contradict or examine the validity of another. It was interesting that Byers was prepared to put his name to such an opinion when he most likely took the view that the PMA Bill did not meet the conditions of Section 57. Kerr was very dubious about this joint opinion, but said that he acted on the advice on the basis that the courts could later hold the resulting law invalid. He wrote to the Queen's private secretary saying that he accepted the opinion because he did not think that as Governor-General he should be his own lawyer. It was this experience, however, that planted the seeds of distrust between Kerr and the Crown Law officers. While he was unsurprised by Murphy's approach to legal issues, he was surprised that the Solicitor General did not advise upon whether the bill satisfied the terms of Section 57. He did smell a rat. He seemed to think that Byers was ducking disagreement with Murphy or being muzzled by not being asked for advice, and it led him to doubt the legal advice that he was receiving. He wasn't confident that he was getting the full story. And he was right. Kerr was also right about the PMA Bill on both counts. First, that it should be put to a joint sitting, which the High Court accepted in Cormack and Cope, and second, that it breached the terms of Section 57 and was invalid, which the High Court later accepted in the case of Victoria and the Commonwealth and Connor in 1975. By that time, Murphy had moved to the High Court bench, although he didn't sit on that particular case, and Paul Byers was left to argue the validity of a law which he most likely considered invalid. Byers must have felt some vindication in his loss, as no doubt did Kerr. The history of misleading and suspect legal advice to the Governor-General poisoned any relationship of trust and was one factor that contributed to the ultimate downfall of the Whitlam government. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. Join me again next time for the video on the coalition's efforts to manipulate the numbers in the Senate. See you then. Goodbye.